Hello and welcome to this video. I just wanted to thank everybody for watching today, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that yes, this channel, I am striving for it to be dedicated to applying historical and dialectical materialism to the American condition. Yes, the name of my channel is American Marxist. Yes, I am an American. Yes, I am a Marxist. And with understanding that, no, I am not any sort of particular kind of ML. I'm not an ACP member and a MAGA communist. I'm not a soc dem or a dem soc, and I am definitely not a part of the CPUSA, which I find to be a revisionist organization altogether. More or less, I don't even affiliate with the general hemisphere of Marxist-Leninist and MLism altogether. Um, these days, I've been more keen to just being labeled a Marxist, or if we're going to complicate it using ideological name tagging, I am honestly becoming more favorable over the term technocrat or technocratic syndicalist. But with that out of the way, let's get back into the video. The topic for today is commerce versus capitalism, and let's just talk briefly on the history of capitalism. Capitalism has existed now for at most 500 years. Economics are as old as civilization and class society itself. The origins of this date back to we can think of as the River Valley civilization. So you think of Mesopotamia, you think of the Nile River, you think of the Yellow River, you think of all of these, the Indus Valley, right? All of these geographical areas where societies and civilizations were first constructed, where primitive accumulation was occurring. This was the epoch of what started class society, and this is where commerce can actually see or be brought to its origin point. Now, there were economic relations, sure, as Marx describes primitive communism or the nomadic tribal societies of pre-class society. Um, there were relations in those societies, but they were very primitive. And they were far different than the way that class relations operate in the modern context. But yeah, let's just understand that. Commerce is old, ancient, as old as civilization itself. Capitalism, broadly new, 3 to 500 years old. When people think about economics before capitalism, they often assume it is just a primitive version of what we have today. But commerce, the idea of buying, selling, and trading have existed for thousands of years, even without capitalism. To understand why, we must take a step back and separate the two things that we usually confuse: commerce and capitalism. Commerce is as old as class society itself. In Mesopotamia, merchants recorded debts on clay tablets. In Greece and Rome, bustling markets became centers of exchange. Trades in these societies played a very different role than it does under capitalism. Farmers, artisans, and communities would primarily produce for direct use or direct consumption: food to eat, clothes to wear, tools to work the land, etc., etc., etc. When they enter the marketplace with these items that they would produce, they did so not to exchange one commodity or they did so to exchange one commodity for another. As Marx describes this in an economic circuit, CMC, where the commodity is exchanged for money and money is then exchanged for a new commodity, a farmer would bring such things as like grains or wheat to the market. He would sell this for silver, and then he would use that silver to buy a plow or cloth for the use that he needs to fill. The cycle begins and ends with the simple aspect of use. Money in this context is nothing but a middleman. It is a medium of exchange, as one may say. The world of the world of then, prior to capitalism, it varies. It's fundamentally different. Commerce was embedded within the larger social structures. The status, the custom, and the stabilities mattered more than accumulation itself. Merchants in this society were often managerial figures, sometimes even distrusted because of their pursuit of gain seemed to detach from the moral economy of compatibility and need. What we hadn't yet seen in this era of slave societies, feudal societies, pre-capitalist economics was the very distinctive logic that capitalism has. In capitalism, exchange is reversed. The circuit now becomes M to C to M prime, where money is exchanged for commodity, and commodity is then sold for a greater quantity of money, for money. Instead of trading to get what one may need, assuming you're the capitalist, or you, the possessor of a commodity, are exchanging to end up with more than what you started. Profit, not use, becomes the fundamental goal and aspect of capitalism. In that shift, C to MC, or from C to MC to M to C to M prime, this is what marks the historical break between commerce as a supplement to life and commerce as an engine of social reproduction. As human societies grew, trade networks would expand far beyond just local villages and small spans of land, right? So we think historically we would look back to the Silk Road stretching from China to the Mediterranean. This Silk Road would often carry silk, spices, metals, and even ideas across continents. Roman merchants moved goods from Britain to North Africa and the Middle East, using coins, contracts, and early banking instruments to facilitate this exchange. In medieval Europe, commerce took on a more structured form. Guilds controlled crafts and trade in towns, regulating quality, setting standards, and training apprentices. Markets and fairs became central hubs of exchange. Yet the goal was rarely unrestrained profit. Trade existed alongside feudal obligations. Lords collected rent, peasants would work the land, and merchants operated within these social hierarchies. Economic activity was constrained by custom, law, and social expectation. By the time of mercantilism, commerce had begun to interact with state power more directly. European monarchies, as an example, would pursue colonies, accumulation, and monopolistic charters to enrich the crown. Even then, production was not organized around wage labor or profit in the capital sense, the very things that define what capitalism is and the relations that are taking form under modern capitalism. Merchants could be wealthy and trades could be lucrative, but the logic of accumulation did not govern the very basis of society itself. And this is largely due to the fact that capitalism and capitalist relations hadn't been the dominant relations, the dominant ideology of that era. And this is how it is. With every mode of production, a mode of production can only take form when it is the dominant it is the dominant social relations that are governing society. Commerce remained a tool of the social, political, and religious life, embedded and regulated and often even moralized, rather than autonomous profit-driven systems that would later emerge as capitalism. In short, these centuries would show commerce as a complex, social, integrated practice. It connected people and regions and allowed specialization and supported early markets, but it had not yet become a system that demanded endless growth and the extraction of surplus or the commodification of labor itself. Capitalist logic was still centuries away. And this is largely due to the fact that capitalism would emerge alongside the Enlightenment era and the series of industrial revolutions from the first to the third. These were kind of the centuries, the eras that defined the emergence of capitalism itself. When does commerce actually become capitalism, though? The transformation never happened overnight, and it doesn't happen overnight. To understand the unfolding through a series of historic ruptures between the 16th and 19th centuries, fundamentally reorganizing society, we need to look at a couple of understandings first. First, enclosures in England and later across Europe dispossessed peasants from common lands, where once families farmed for their subsistence and participated in local exchange, they now became landless, with no choice but to sell their labor for wages, essentially, or i.e., their labor power. This created the working class, the proletariat, a class whose labor could be bought and sold, and the essential conditions for the capitalist production. Second, European colonial expansion brought vast, wealthy, and new markets. Ships would cross the Atlantic carrying sugar, cotton, silver, and enslaved labor. Colonial plunder would inject enormous capital into European economies, fueling the rise of merchant banking networks and financing industry and industrial ventures. Trade was no longer simply about moving goods, it became the basis for accumulation, reinvestment, and the systemic growth of wealth itself. Third, the Industrial Revolution mechanized production. Factories would replace workshops. Laborers no longer controlled the means of production. They owned only their ability to work. Unlike the pre-capitalist logic of exchange, that circuit of commodity to money to commodity, it would then change where goods were traded to satisfy, or it would then change from the understanding of goods being traded to satisfy needs into the capital circulation that would follow, as Marx described, M to C to M prime, money, commodity to larger quantities of money. Money is invested to buy commodities, particularly labor power, to produce goods that could be sold and can be sold for greater quantities of money. Understanding this, the goal would then become accumulation and not subsistence. This shift reorganized society itself. Production, previously embedded in communities and social obligations, became subordinate to profit. Capitalism created a new social relation: the capitalist, who owns the means of production, and the worker, who must sell their labor to survive. Markets, money, and trade now functioned as instruments of the system, rather than as supplementary tools of life itself. In short, understanding this, we understand that capitalism emerged not from the existence of commerce alone, but rather from a combination of global expansion, industrial technology, and primarily the institutionalization of wage labor. This was a historical creation, a new social order with a logic and trajectory distinct from any society that had come before. This is the very essence of what is the dialectic method. That Marx turned Hegel on his head and understood that with every system of socioeconomics, they would arise to a point in their evolutionary state, in their developmental process, of contradictions which then would have to be overcome. And this is what made capitalism so distinctive from the societies that came before, was that it solved the contradictions of feudalism and slave society by allowing people free will and the agent of individual, but it did so in creating new contradictions along the way: exploitation, wage labor, infinite growth amongst a finite planet. So this is what came out of it, and this is why we would understand that capitalism did not emerge from purely commerce alone, but rather these very combinations that I have now described. Today, it often feels like capitalism is natural, inevitable, or even eternal. A good understanding of this very phenomenon is explained in Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. I highly recommend people to read it. It very much highlights why people have this drawing nature to justify capitalism and capital at every growth, even when they don't own capital themselves. Laborers under capitalism do this. Workers do this, largely because they're not conscious, or they're lacking class consciousness, and that capitalism or commodity fetishism, as Marx describes in Capital Volume 1 and Volume 2, he talks about this, but essentially people become alienated to such a degree where the only social attachments that they can get are from capital and commodity forms itself. Everywhere we look, from supermarkets, online shopping, banking apps, and global logistics, it seems like human life has always revolved around buying, selling, and seeking profits. Politicians, economists, and media often will blur the line between ordinary trade and the capitalist system itself, as if buying a loaf of bread is equivalent to orchestrating global finance. But capitalism is not just commerce. It is historically a specific system where production itself is subordinate to profit, where social relations are organized around accumulation. In a factory, a worker might spend 8 hours producing goods, yet the value they create exceeds their wages. This unpaid labor becomes surplus value, extracted by the capitalist, reinvested into production, and used to expand capital. Unlike ancient merchants or medieval guilds, capitalism does not aim to sustain life, maintain social order, or preserve tradition. Its goal is constant growth, competition, and accumulation, which Marx often called the endless cycle of MC and prime. Capitalism also transforms the social and spatial environment. Supply chains span continents, finance dictates global production, and technology reorganizes labor into digital, automated forms. Everything from raw materials to human work becomes a potential source of profit. Meanwhile, in this very system, the system will hide its own origins and contingencies. We are taught that this is simply human nature, that markets, money, and competition have always existed in this very way. But this is just fundamentally not true. Yes, money and markets have existed for a long period of history, but have fundamentally changed and altered their relations and functions with the emergence of capitalism. Understanding capitalism as a specific historical creation, this is what truly matters. It was born from enclosures of colonialism and industrialization. It could not exist without wage labor, private ownership over the means of productions, and because of this, it is historically constituted. It is fundamentally not eternal. Just as it emerged and it can be transformed, replaced by a system where commerce serves human need rather than capital accumulation. This is the very essence of what Marx claims to be the dialectical unfolding of history, where capitalism isn't eternal. Just as slave economy was replaced by feudalism, feudalism was then replaced by capitalism, so too will capitalism meet its end and will be replaced by a new social organization of relations, a new economic system altogether. Now, Marx and many of his followers, many of the people who were inspired or worked closely to him throughout his life, would often propose this to be socialism. There's other ideas of what might come after capitalism as well. More contemporary is the idea of techno-feudalism. um, Rosa Luxemburg, she talked about socialism or barbarism if socialism failed to come about, that the contradictions existing under uh, capitalism itself would lead to barbarism, a endless cycle of just rapid decay, to the destruction of all social relations, and a environmental degrading of society as we know it. So that's just a couple of things to understand. It's not a matter of looking at capitalism, ideologically justifying it as the liberal media and liberal institutions lately have, but to understand it as its historical contingency that it is, and that it itself is to be sublated. Commerce is ancient, capitalism is modern. For thousands of years, humans exchanged goods to meet needs, maintain communities, and sustain life itself. Trade was embedded in social structures, regulated by customs, and oriented towards use rather than profit. Farmers, artisans, and merchants participated in commerce without creating the exploitative social relations we now associate with capitalism. Capitalism, by contrast, reorganizes society around accumulation, private ownership, and wage labor. It transforms trade from a tool in a system that governs its life itself to the very shift from CMC to MCM prime. This is more than an economic formula. It is the logic that makes profit the ultimate goal and social reproduction dependent on extraction. Just to quickly wrap this up, it is very important that we understand these criticisms and these analysis of capitalism. That way, globally, we can come together to deconstruct and reorganize society. Re, reorganizing society and reorganizing the distinction is essential. Capitalism is not inevitable, natural, or eternal. It is historically specific, and because it is historical, it can be changed. Understanding commerce as a human practice that predates and exceeds capitalism opens the door to imagining alternatives, systems where production serves human need, where labor is a social and cooperative relation, and where exchange exists without exploitation itself. Thank you.